Hey guys, tonight we trace the quiet footsteps of a man who forever changed the way we see life itself, yet kept his most powerful discovery hidden for 2 long decades. This is Charles Darwin, the scientist who hid his theory for 20 years. You feel the boards of the beagle beneath your feet as they creak like old bones against the restless Atlantic. The salt air clings to your cheeks. Wind slices in from the gray horizon, thick with gull cries and the scent of distant storms. You're only 22, barely out of university, not a sailor, not even officially a naturalist, just a passenger with a passion for collecting beetles and sketching rocks. And yet somehow, you've been chosen. So before you settle in, gently tap that like button and subscribe only if this kind of storytelling truly speaks to you. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it there right now? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand on the deck, clinging to the railing, unsure whether the churning in your stomach is seasickness or the beginning of something larger, something that might eventually shake the foundations of faith, empire, and identity itself. Your cabin is smaller than a closet. A hammock swings like a pendulum. There's barely space to turn around, but already it's cluttered with jars, pinned insects, and bundles of notes. You sketch by lantern light, naming and labeling, but not yet knowing what it all means. The journey stretches before you, nearly 5 years of ports and peaks, of flora and fever. You're supposed to be mapping coastlines, but secretly, you're watching the world with the eyes of someone trying to read between the lines of creation. When you land in South America, it's not the big cities that captivate you. It's the bones, giant sloths, half buried in the ground, fossils of extinct beasts that look eerily like creatures still roaming nearby plains. What kind of creator, you wonder quietly, would erase a species just to draw a slightly different version? In the evenings, you scribble notes on tiny scraps of paper, while the others drink or gamble. The crew calls you flycatcher, with a smile that isn't always kind. You say little. You just collect seeds, shells, animal skulls. You don't know it yet, but you're also collecting doubts. You visit Tierra del Fuego, where native families huddle around smoky fires, bare against the cold. The British crew sees them as savage, but you see something else different, without inferiority. Their lives, their tools, their gestures, all adapted perfectly to their world. And it nags at you. If they've adapted, why not animals? Why not everything? Months pass. The ship becomes a floating prison, then a moving library. You read Lyell's Principles of Geology over and over. Uniformitarianism, slow change over vast time. You start to see the coastline not as fixed, but as fluid. Even the cliffs seem to breathe in deep time. Then in Brazil, you walk under jungle canopies, so dense the light turns green. Monkeys chatter overhead. Orchids bloom with impossible color. And everything buzzes with motion, hunger, evolution. Not that you dare say that word yet. One night, in a thunderstorm, off the coast of Chile, you feel the beagle roll so sharply, you crash from your hammock. Lightning splits the sea. And you, so often sick, so often shy, find yourself laughing. You are alive, and the world is wild, and somewhere in this chaos, there is meaning waiting to be named. It's not all glory. You miss home. Letters arrive months late, if at all. You bury your nose in specimens to escape the weight of homesickness. Your father's voice echoes from across the Atlantic, still skeptical, still calling this voyage a waste of time. But on the island of Santiago in the Galapagos, everything changes. You kneel in the dust and pick up a finch. Small, ordinary, except its beak is thick and curved in a way that suggests it's made for crushing seeds. Later you find another same body, different beak, this one needle sharp. Then another, and another. You're told they all come from different islands just miles apart. You don't yet have the words natural selection, but something flickers. Back aboard the Beagle, you draw birds by lantern light. You start comparing, noticing how slight environmental changes seem to breed entirely new traits. Could these birds be cousins, not strangers? Could they have once been one? You don't say it out loud, not yet, but your pulse quickens. Even the tortoises, slow, patient old as stone, have island-specific shells. One bends sharply up at the front, as if made for reaching taller shrubs. You watch it stretch its neck, perfectly built for the plants around it. You wonder, is this design or response? At night, the stars crowd the sky so densely it feels like you could fall upward. You lie awake and let the questions pile on top of you. What if species weren't created in fixed forms? What if life could change? Your heart says yes, but your world isn't ready to hear it. So you file your sketches, pack your fossils, and say nothing yet. You stand once more on Galapagos soil boots, crunching against black volcanic grit. The air here feels different, saltier, quieter, ancient, as if the land itself remembers being born from fire and sea. There's a hush, even among the animals, as if they too are waiting for you to notice something no one else has dared to. You walk slowly, deliberately, notebook in hand. A mockingbird hops across your path. Its beak is slightly longer than the one you saw yesterday, more curved, less blunt. You frown. You sketch. Then you see another and another. 4 islands, 4 birds, 4 beaks. One genus, but wildly different tools. You write that down. Could these differences mean new species? The idea feels dangerous, heretical, like stealing fire. So you cloak it in softer language. Variation, adaptation, words with just enough ambiguity to keep you safe for now. And then come the tortoises. Massive, slow-living boulders. You squat beside one, gently brushing your hand across the ridges of its shell. A local tells you they can tell which island a tortoise comes from by its shell alone. You raise an eyebrow. Really? Geography shaping biology. You sip water, watching the tortoise stretch its neck upward to graze on thorny brush. The way its shell arches like a saddle it's built to reach. But others on wetter islands have domed shells and shorter necks. They eat low shrubs. Your mind begins to race. This isn't coincidence. It's context shaping form, function shaping future. You laugh softly, muttering, "Well, that's inconvenient." Here on these remote islands, nature isn't uniform. It's experimental, messy, alive. You jot a joke in your notes. God clearly favors prototypes, but beneath the humor, something stirs. You begin to see nature not as a static painting, but a living manuscript rewritten with each generation. You have no name for it yet, but in your bones you feel it. Life responds. Back on the Beagle, you try to stay objective. You log specimen after specimen, packing them for transport to England. But the rhythm of the waves becomes the rhythm of your thoughts. What if all life is connected, not just metaphorically, but through ancestry? You imagine a tree, its branches splitting each fork, a moment of divergence. A bird here, a lizard there. What if the same root gives rise to all this? What if species are just stories still being written? But even as the theory forms, you bury it, literally. In a stack of notebooks, you mark private. One of them you label transmutation of species. You don't show it to the captain, or your bunkmate, or your future self, not just yet. Because what you're beginning to suspect isn't just a scientific bombshell, it's a spiritual one. You remember a sermon back in Shrewsbury, your uncle pacing the front of the chapel, thunder in his voice. God created every creature, great and small, each after its kind. But here in the Galapagos, it seems nature didn't follow the script. If these animals were designed once and perfectly, why would they keep changing? You spend hours watching marine iguanas slither from the surf, spitting salt from their nostrils like tiny dragons. They feed on seaweed, not insects like their cousins. Their tails have flattened. Their claws have sharpened. Evolution, you think, but you don't use that word yet. Not even in your own head. Instead, you tell yourself, I'm just observing, just recording, nothing more. But observation has its own gravity. And once you've seen the pattern, you can't unsee it. One night, while anchored offshore, you lie in your hammock and reread your notes by candlelight. Dozens of entries, dozens of animals, patterns everywhere. Your brain hums awake. And for a moment, it's all so obvious you laugh aloud, then you stop, because the laughter feels like betrayal. You close the notebook and stare into the dark. You think of Emma, gentle, devout, full of faith. You think of your father, of Cambridge, of the men who taught you that life is divine order. And yet, the mockingbird didn't care about their theology. It changed anyway. You whisper, what if I'm wrong? But deeper still, a voice whispers back, what if you're right and afraid? You try to sleep. The waves rock you like a cradle. But your thoughts don't quiet. They multiply, speciate evolve. At breakfast, someone jokes that you care more for lizards than people. You smile sheepish and deflect. But part of you agrees. At least the lizards don't ask questions you're not ready to answer. When you leave the islands, the sun is high and pitiless. You look back once at the rocks, the birds, the strange beauty that rewired your soul, and promise yourself you'll return. Not physically, perhaps, but in thought, in theory. The Galapagos will live inside you now, a pressure behind your ribs, a thrum in your fingertips. You watch the island shrink as the Beagle sails west toward other lands, other samples, other long nights of feverish thought. But the real journey, you realize, has only just begun. And somewhere in the belly of the ship, packed tight among butterflies and beetles, lies an idea that may never see daylight. At least, not yet. Back in your cabin, rocking gently to the pulse of the Pacific, you begin to draw not just what you see, but what you suspect. Ink bleeds into parchment as the thought takes form. Beaks, shells, claws, 1,000 tiny variations. You map them like constellations, but these stars do not stand still. They shift and branch, responding to pressures you're only beginning to name. Your hands are steady, but your mind flutters like a moth to candlelight. What if one form could become another? What if over time, slow and unseen, a land lizard could become a sea one, not by miracle, but necessity? You sketch 2 lizards side by side, one thick-tailed and dry, the other sleek, salt-spewing, suited for surf. You draw a thin, speculative arrow between them. You hesitate, then darken the line. This moment is not for science, not for publication. It's for you, in secret. A whisper on paper. Outside, the crew shouts over dinner. Inside, the lamp burns low. You pull a leather-bound notebook close and begin what will become the first of many volumes. Notebook B, Transmutation of Species. It sounds clinical, safe, but you know what you're doing. You're cracking open the vault. You write late into the night, fingers stained, eyes gritty. It's not about proving yet. It's about asking, wondering, sketching shadows. You imagine ancient creatures climbing toward light inch by inch, generation after generation. You don't know what to call it. Not evolution. That word still belongs to poets and radicals. Instead, you draw trees. Roots branching upward, outward endlessly. Not one tree, but many. Some die off. Others bloom. Life as a tangle, not a ladder. Sometimes you chuckle to yourself. Nature's a doodler, you whisper. She can't help herself. You invent little diagrams. A cluster of barnacles here, pigeons there, always with arrows and question marks. You sketch one pigeon with exaggerated feathers and call it the punk of the species. The next day, a beetle with armor so ornate it looks designed by an over-enthusiastic silversmith. You start naming patterns like pets. Descent with modification. Divergence of character. You're still years from a title that will shake the world, but these are your blueprints, and they live for now in silence. The beagle rolls across oceans. You visit coral atolls, mountain ranges, vast deserts. But always you return to your papers. They spread like roots across your desk. When a wave tosses ink across a page, you joke that perhaps the sea is editing me. You worry sometimes that you're imagining all of it, that no one else will see what you see, that perhaps you're just a man too fond of birds. And then late one evening, you remember Malthus. You pull his little gray book from your trunk, an essay on the principle of population. You read and reread until your eyes ache. The idea sparks struggle. More organisms born than can survive. A competition for resources. The strong live. The weak fade. Nature selects. Quietly, ruthlessly. Not once. Always. Your heart races. You jot it quickly. Favorable variations preserved. Unfavorable ones destroyed. This is natural selection. You stare at the words. There it is. Not in poetry. Not in divine decree. But in cold, beautiful mechanics. Not chaos, not chance, but a soft, endless sorting. You lean back, your pulse hammers in your ears, then you smile and whisper, "Oh, that's it." But you don't publish it, not yet, not even close. Instead, you place the notebook at the bottom of your sea chest, beneath dried leaves and labeled skulls. You tell yourself it's not ready, that it needs refining, that it's just a thought. But deep down, you know the truth. You're afraid of the church, of your father's disapproval, of Emma's quiet faith, of losing the respect of men who quote Genesis louder than reason. And perhaps most of all, afraid of what it means about you. If everything is flux, then what anchors you? Still you write. You always write. You pen letters to Henslow Fitzroy, your cousin Fox. You mention the birds, the turtles, but not the theory, not the tree. A gentle lie of omission. You draft an essay just for yourself. 40 pages of delicate phrasing. You call it an abstract. You hide it with your socks. The beagle nears home. You feel your stomach tighten. What waits for you in England isn't just family, it's expectation. And once you step off that gangplank, your secret, becomes heavier to carry. But for now, in your floating study, you rest your hand on the cover of your hidden notebook. You feel the ship breathe. You feel the future humming beneath your fingertips. A theory born in salt and sketches, still silent, but no longer asleep. You return with a beard, a limp, and 1,000 bones in tow. The docks of Falmouth are gray and glistening rain curling at your collar. You step off the Beagle and onto cobblestone with a chest full of specimens and a head full of dangerous thoughts. You're 27, and the world has changed while you were gone, or maybe it's only you who has. Crowds bustle past, porters shout, horses clatter by, but everything feels slower now, muffled. You're used to jungle birds and sea winds not drawing rooms and dinner bells. As your luggage is carted off, you can't help but glance at your crates, numbered, sealed, and anonymous to everyone but you. They hold feathers, fossils, and the quiet seed of a theory you've dared not voice. You're not returning to a hero's welcome. No trumpets, no medals, just a modest note in the newspaper that a survey voyage has ended. You shrug it off. You've always preferred silence to spectacle. But back in London, word spreads among the naturalists. The young Darwin has brought back wonders. You attend meetings cautiously at first. Men in starched collars pass around your beetles. They nod at your notes. Fitzroy publishes the official Beagle narrative, his own version of the voyage. It's heavy with God's glory. You smile politely. Your own account, meanwhile, sits unfinished. You move into a house near Regent's Park and try to reacclimate. The brick walls feel claustrophobic, the city air thick. You long for Galapagos winds, for the soothing rhythm of waves. You find yourself escaping into long walks, then longer hours in your study. Your notebooks pile higher. You begin to arrange your thoughts cautiously. You reread your diagrams. You murmur the words under your breath. Selection, divergence, modification. But still, you tell no one. At parties, you sip wine slowly and steer the conversation toward geology, pigeons, barnacles, anything but your growing suspicion that species are not fixed. Anything but the possibility that life itself may be in constant flux. They ask you for tales of savages, storms, exotic beasts. You oblige with practiced charm. You even throw in a joke or two about your seasickness, your ever-reliable punchline. But the truth of what you saw the real storm, it's still locked inside your chest. Sometimes you find yourself rehearsing in the mirror. In letters never sent. How would you explain it? How would you survive the fallout? One evening, you dine with the great Sir Richard Owen. He admires your fossils, your classifications. But when he speaks of divine design, you nod carefully, eyes cast down. You are in a room full of believers, the only man carrying a match. You visit your father in Shrewsbury. The house smells of polished wood and old sermons. He asks what you'll do now. You mumble something about cataloging barnacles. He nods, not understanding that this work is both shield and shovel. You need time. You need distance. You need to keep pretending you're a respectable gentleman of science, not a heretic in the making. You write to Emma. Her letters had followed you across oceans. Now your replies must navigate something murkier than tides love entangled with faith. She believes in providence, in design, in answers. You believe in questions. She signs her letters with prayers. You read them with trembling hands. Still you propose. She accepts. And for a brief flickering moment, it feels like homecoming. But beneath the joy, the doubt returns. You wonder if she'll still love you when she learns the truth, that the God she clutches may be missing from the margins of your tree. You whisper to yourself, not yet, not now. Instead, you begin to turn your theory sideways. You study artificial selection pigeons, bred for color cows, for milk dogs, for size. If humans can shape nature through intention, then what of nature's own invisible hand? You collect case after case. You dissect. You document. You never stop writing, but always in private. One foggy morning, walking along the Thames, a thought lands like a feather on your shoulder. Perhaps the theory should stay secret. Perhaps it's too much. You laugh bitterly this time. That's the second joke you've made to yourself today. You're getting good at those. Back in your study, surrounded by labeled jars and endless notes, you run your fingers along the edge of a sealed envelope, your early draft. No one has read it. You tuck it deeper into the drawer. You tell yourself you're waiting for more evidence, but really, you're waiting for the world to change, or for courage, whichever comes first. The morning of your wedding dawns with a soft English mist rolling through the hedgerows of Mare. You button your collar with trembling hands, not from nerves of matrimony, but from the unspoken tension lodged between love and belief. You glance in the mirror, hair slightly tousled, expression calm, and for a moment you wonder what secrets a man is allowed to keep from the woman who shares his bed. Emma is waiting. She stands in a simple gown of pale silk, her eyes calm and clear. She greets you with a smile that doesn't ask questions, not yet. You take her hand and step into the future. The vows are spoken beneath oak beams and watchful relatives. There's talk of God, of blessing, of divine order. You nod through it all politely like a man holding his breath underwater. Emma believes, deeply, quietly, with the kind of conviction that doesn't shout but settles into rooms like lamplight. She believes in mercy, in the soul, in the afterlife. And you, what do you believe now? You believe in slow change, in fossils and finches, in things becoming other things. And yet you also believe in her. In the months that follow, you build a life in the countryside, a house called Down. It's quiet. The garden blooms. Inside your study fills with jars, sketches, pigeon bones. Emma plays piano in the drawing room while you sketch out notes on divergence. She hums a Bach prelude while you wonder if barnacles feel pain. It works, this odd harmony. You talk sometimes about belief. Softly, carefully. She asks questions. You answer with hesitation. You explain natural law not because you're trying to convince her, but because it's the only language your mind speaks now. She listens, and then she says gently, "But where is the soul in that? You don't know." So instead, you hold her hand. You fill your days with quiet rituals. Walks in the meadow, experiments in the greenhouse, long letters to colleagues, even longer evenings by the fire. You cough often. Your health has become unpredictable. One day, you're digging in the garden. The next, you're pale with nausea and retreating to your study like a wounded animal. Emma brings you tea tucks, blankets around your knees, sings softly if you ask. And you wonder if she suspects the theory is blooming faster than you can contain it. In private, your work deepens. You breed pigeons obsessively, blue bar, fantail powder. You clip wings, measure beaks, log lineage after lineage. Neighbors find it odd. Some chuckle. You just smile. If they only knew you were mapping the threads of transformation itself with every feather. You jot another note. If humans can do this in a few decades, what could nature do in 1,000,000 years? Emma walks in while you're holding a deformed chick in your palm. You glance up, caught. She says nothing, just lays a hand on your shoulder. There is understanding there, but also sadness. In the evenings, you read to her. Shakespeare, Milton, sometimes sermons. She reads to you from the New Testament, soft and certain. You try not to flinch. You love her faith, but it reminds you of the gap that yawns quietly between you. One evening, while rain taps the window pane, she places a letter on your desk. You recognize her handwriting, tidy and round. In it she writes, "I know you question things that I take on faith. I do not fear your questions, but I worry for your peace. If you were to lose all belief, all comfort of eternity, what would be left to hold on to? What would sustain you?" You read it 3 times. Then fold it gently and place it in your top drawer beside your notes. On species divergence, you don't write back. Instead, you make her laugh at dinner. Later you whisper, "I'm trying to find truth, Emma. Not to destroy anything, just to understand." She nods, brushing a hand over your fevered brow. "Then promise me one thing," she says, "that if you ever feel what you find might hurt the world, you'll hold it gently." You nod. And for now you do. You hold the theory like a newborn animal alive, squirming, fragile. You add notes. You draw more trees, but still, no one sees it. You attend a baptism. You kneel at a pew. You bow your head beside hers and murmur the prayers by memory. And all the while you wonder if every species comes from another, if every change is natural, incremental, inevitable. Where does the divine begin? Does it begin? At night, you stare at the ceiling, counting heartbeats. The theory waits below you, in your desk, in your notebooks, in the air. It's growing, feeding, taking shape. And still you do not publish. Because Emma is kind. Because the world is not. Because you love too much to set fire to what others call holy. You rise each morning, with the birds, sometimes not by choice. The illness has deepened unwelcome, but persistent, like fog in the joints. Some days begin with nausea, others with a leaden ache that settles behind your eyes. It slows you, yes, but it doesn't stop you. In the quiet hours before Emma stirs, you return to your notebooks. Ink-stained, weather-wrinkled pages, dog-eared from years of hesitating. You run your fingers down the familiar phrases, descent with modification, struggle for existence, natural selection. And then always, in the margin, not yet, not yet. Downhouse becomes your refuge and your prison. You rarely venture into London anymore. The very thought of the city, its noise, its expectations leaves your chest tight. You claim ill health as reason enough. But there's more than fever behind your retreat. You are hiding. From critics, from friends, from your own theory. You tell people you're busy with barnacles. And you are. For 8 years, in fact. You dissect hundreds of them, cataloging minute variations with obsessive precision. Friends gently ask why. But you know why. Because barnacles don't pray. Barnacles don't write sermons, or burn heretics, or print angry pamphlets. They sit on rocks, silent, obliging. They let you study variation without fear. You tell yourself that barnacles are preparation groundwork, but they are also shield and stalling tactic. Still, the work is real. You make genuine discoveries, structure reproduction, classification. You become the authority on cirripedes, a word no one can pronounce, but everyone in science now respects. Your reputation grows, quietly, respectfully. But the real work, the tree, the transformation, the trembling idea that remains locked away. You correspond with other scientists. Lyle, Hooker, Huxley. You ask sly questions. Do you believe species are immutable? Most reply cautiously, some with derision, a few with curiosity. No one dares say what you're thinking. At night, you walk your garden path in circles, round and round beneath the apple trees beside Emma's rose bushes. It's where you think best, where your mind rearranges its parts. You stop sometimes to observe a worm, a leaf, a budding flower. You crouch like a child and whisper, "Show me how you change." The children chase each other in the background, George with his spectacles too large, Annie with her gentle laugh. Their lives swell with light and simple questions. You envy that. But also, you take notes. Every family resemblance, every inherited quirk, every small mutation passed from parent to child. You're living in a living laboratory, and yet you still don't publish. You've written nearly 250,000 words in draft. Your theory is clear, your case is compelling. But every time you consider unleashing it, your hands still. Because you know what it means. To say species change is to say man is not separate. That we share a root with worm, with ape, with every living thing that's ever crawled or flown or flowered. And worse to say, there is no divine blueprint, only process. The implications shudder through you. At dinner, you glance at Emma. She's reading a letter. The fire flickers. One of the children asks why stars don't fall. Another wonders where God keeps the angels. You smile and answer carefully. You study your own reluctance like a specimen. Name its parts: fear of shame, of harm, of theological rupture. You sketch it mentally. Perhaps you joke to yourself, natural selection operates not only in biology, but in ideas, and some must remain hidden to survive. One afternoon, Hooker visits. You walk together past the vegetable beds. He asks directly again what you truly believe, and again you answer vaguely. He narrows his eyes. You have something, don't you? Something big. You pause and offer him a soft truth. Only something I'm not yet brave enough to say aloud. Hooker nods. Later, he writes you a letter. In it, he says he understands, that he too has questions, that he too has hesitated. And you feel for the first time a glimmer of companionship in your doubt. Still the days drift by. You write. You revise. You read poetry to Emma. You breed more pigeons. You watch the garden change with seasons, always thinking, does nature miss the things it lets go of? Or does it simply adapt? Sometimes, late at night, you hold your manuscript in your hands. It's thick now, alive in its own way. It whispers, "Let me out." And you almost do. But then you remember the world and tuck it back into the drawer. The symptoms return with a rhythm you cannot predict. One day, you are walking the garden paths, jacket unbuttoned, whistling to yourself. And the next, you're hunched over in your study chair, hands shaking, mouth tasting of copper and bile. Doctors debate tropical fever, digestive disorder, nerve collapse. You nod through their theories, but say little. There are no tests for the burden you carry. Emma fusses with your tea, chamomile, a cloth for your forehead. She keeps her voice light, but her eyes study you the way you study orchids attentively, with concern, as if decoding a hidden message. You squeeze her hand. Tell her you're just tired, that you'll rest. But rest is a lie. You sleep in fragments. Your mind keeps working, building models, rerunning arguments, redrawing trees in your dreams. The children learn not to disturb you in the mornings. You lie in bed past noon, the curtains half drawn, breath shallow. The house breathes around you. Emma's soft footsteps. A clock ticking. Distant laughter from the orchard. And beneath it all, a steady murmur from your desk drawer. The theory waits. Is your illness real? Yes. Is it also convenient? Also yes. It protects you. No one expects bold action from a man who flinches at sunlight. You become the gentleman invalid respected, excused a scientific recluse. And in your own quiet way, you cultivate that role like a species perfectly suited to its niche. But not all of it is self-preservation. Some of it is grief. When little Annie falls ill, the world begins to unravel. Her breath grows shallow, her skin pale, the doctor's face unreadable. You sit beside her bed, telling soft stories about South America, about giant tortoises, about birds with musical calls. She smiles weakly, eyes half-lidded, whispering, "Tell the one about the volcano again." You do. You'd give anything to keep her. But nature, your beloved, merciless nature, does not negotiate. When she dies, something inside you quiets. Something folds inward, like a wing clipped mid-flight. You walk the garden path alone. No diagrams, no pigeons, just silence. Emma prays. She always prays. You do not. You stop going to church. And though you never say it aloud, you stop believing entirely in the idea of a benevolent force guiding all this life. If there is a God, he selects cruelly. In your study, you stare for hours at a blank page. Then slowly, painfully, you return to work. The barnacles, the orchids, the geological columns. You build walls of data around your grief. Your illness returns more fiercely now. Pain in the joints, spasms in your gut, an invisible pressure behind your ribs. You consult specialists, take waters, drink powders, go on doctor-prescribed retreats. You're sent to Malvern for hydrotherapy, cold water wraps, sponge baths, and early bedtimes. The regimen is barbaric and boring, and yet, in that monotony, you begin to breathe again. You wake to mist-draped hills and the scent of wet pine. You sit on a bench for hours wrapped in blankets staring at nothing. The stillness is medicinal. Your mind wanders. You begin tentatively to sketch again. One morning, with steam rising off the lawns, you write in a new notebook. It is not the strongest who survive, nor the most intelligent, but those most responsive to change. You pause. That line hums with clarity. But you still don't publish. Instead, you reorganize your notes, create an abstract for yourself, then another. You sharpen your arguments, one cautious paragraph at a time. You give lectures, harmless ones on beetles and barnacle sex. The dangerous ideas remain under wraps. You tell yourself, let others say it first. Let the world move a little. But deep down, you know the world will not move until you push it. Even so, you linger in the shadows. You take long walks, sit for hours among ferns, stare at bees pollinating flowers. You begin writing on the fertility of orchids, how their intricate, seductive designs lure insects into performing the intimate labor of nature's grand experiment. You call it adaptation. But it is seduction, really. A trick of structure and scent. A partnership forged by need, not design. You send the manuscript off. It's well received. Polite applause. No outrage. Just science modest and digestible. You smile. Another test balloon floated. But the theory, the real one, remains grounded. It grows heavier now. Like an aging child, too big to carry, too fragile to let walk alone. And you wonder more than once whether you've grown too fragile yourself, whether the world will hear you, or whether it will tear you apart. So you stall again. You write another letter, another cautious draft, another essay locked in a drawer, and wait for courage to evolve. You begin to measure your days by letters. The creak of the postman's boots on the gravel path, the flap of the envelope, the inked names of men who orbit your work, Lyle Hooker Gray. Some write with curiosity, some with caution. Only a few suspect what you're truly circling. You write back in measured tones, always polite, always reserved. You share data, not declarations. And yet within each envelope you tuck a thread, an observation, a suggestion, an almost confession. You are testing the climate. Is it warm enough? Has the world thawed? You receive a letter from Asa Gray in America, bright, eager, curious. A man of deep faith, yet open to ideas that smell of heresy. You send him pieces, fragments of the puzzle. You ask, can natural selection coexist with belief? He writes back, perhaps. It's a lifeline of sorts. Not an answer, but a companion in uncertainty. You gather letters like specimens, arrange them, annotate them. They become a new taxonomy, the ecosystem of your doubt. Meanwhile, your manuscript thickens. It breathes under your desk. Every so often, you place your hand on it, like checking the pulse of a beast you've raised in secret. But you still do not publish. Instead, you share your thoughts only with a select few. Hooker becomes more than a friend. He is your sounding board, your safety net. You trust him with more than you trust yourself. Still, even he grows impatient. Publish, Charles, he writes. The world will not wait forever, but you think perhaps it will wait long enough for someone else to say it first. Then I won't have to. You are not lazy. You are not unsure. But the closer you come to unveiling your theory, the more vivid the fallout becomes in your imagination. You envision pamphlets, protests, theologians denouncing you by name, children turning from Emma's prayers, her father's tight-lipped disappointment. You see everything you love twisted under scrutiny, not because you hate God, but because you love truth, enough to follow it somewhere darker. So you wait and write more letters. You correspond with breeders and farmers. You collect endless data on pigs, sheep, corn horses, orchids. You call it preparation. Others call it obsession. But you know what you're doing. You're building armor. One afternoon, a letter arrives with a familiar scrawl. Alfred Russel Wallace, a fellow naturalist, humble, brilliant, often ill-funded, but rich in insight. You'd exchanged polite correspondence over the years, nothing heavy. But this letter is different. He has been working in the Malay archipelago, collecting, thinking, drawing maps in his own mind. And now, he has sent you a paper. You unfold the pages. You read, and your hands go cold. The title, On the Tendency of Varieties to Depart Indefinitely from the Original Type. Your eyes move line by line. His words echo your own almost eerily. He has found it. Alone. Half a world away from different evidence with different language but the same idea. Natural selection. There it is. Your theory in someone else's voice. You sit very still. The study is quiet. Outside, bees hum in the garden. A dog barks in the distance. Somewhere, Emma is reading to the children. But inside you there is only static. For 20 years, you've nurtured this idea in secret, named it, protected it, delayed it, and now someone else has arrived at the same cliff edge ready to shout. What do? You don't panic. Not at first. Instead, you write to Lyle, then to Hooker. You tell them everything. You are calm, factual, respectful, but beneath the ink, there is mourning. Not for the loss of credit. You care little for fame. No, you mourn the illusion of time. You thought you could wait forever. That history would move when you were ready. But nature as always has her own clock. Lyle and Hooker suggest a joint presentation. You and Wallace. A fair solution. You agree graciously, but inside a storm brews. Not anger, not even regret. Just urgency finally awakened. You write Wallace congratulating him. You mean it. You like the man. You admire his mind. But even as you praise him, you begin rewriting your own manuscript faster now with fire. The sleeping beast beneath your desk is stirring. And for the first time, you let yourself wonder, if not now, then when? You sit by the window Wallace's letter, folded in your lap like a verdict. The sky outside is low and gray, the color of ash after flame. A soft rain dapples the garden path where your children once raced. Now the gravel path is empty silent. You find it fitting. Because today, you feel like a ghost in your own life hovering between two worlds. One of quiet retreat, one of public fire. You read the letter again. Wallace has done it. With fewer resources, less acclaim in a jungle thousands of miles away, he's glimpsed the same dangerous truth. Not only that species change, but how they change. Through natural selection, through struggle, through time's patient hand, reshaping every beak bone and root. The very engine of nature discovered independently parallel to your own long silence, and yet he did not hesitate. He sent it to you, trusting you. There's a strange ache in your chest, not from betrayal, but recognition. Wallace is not a rival. He is a mirror, a man who looked into the same abyss and did not look away. You admire him, but more than that, you envy him. You pace your study. You run your fingers along the spines of books that once comforted you. Now they feel heavy old inert. This moment, this collision was always coming. You just hope to reach it at your own pace. You write Wallace a letter, warm, gracious, full of praise. You assure him that his ideas are profound, worthy of attention. And then you tell him the truth, that you too have been working on this theory. Quietly, cautiously, for 2 decades. You assure him you won't obstruct him, won't steal the spotlight. You offer to publish together. You send the letter. Then you sit, with your head in your hands, and wait for history to shift. Lyle and Hooker, your oldest confidants, step in. They suggest a presentation at the Linnean Society Wallace's paper and excerpts of your unpublished writings side by side. A fair solution, balanced, gentle. You agree. What choice do you have? The day of the reading arrives, but you do not. You're at home, buried in grief. Your youngest son, Charles Waring, is dying, just 18 months old. Another child slipping through your fingers. Another life selected out by nature's indifferent hand. Emma weeps beside the crib. You cradle the boy's tiny frame and feel the heat of fever burning through his skin. The house is too quiet, the fire too dim, and far away in a London room of scholars, your theory is finally spoken aloud, but you do not hear it. You are listening to the soft wheezing of your son's last breaths. When the papers arrive from the Linnean Society, you read them with detachment. The reception was tepid, polite, no riots, no sermons, no fire and brimstone, just quiet acknowledgement. One man in the back even yawned. You almost laugh. 20 years of worry, and the world shrugs. But inside, the storm has shifted. Something has broken loose. You begin to write again, but now with urgency. No more sketches. No more guarded drafts. You put aside the unfinished big book and begin a smaller one. A distilled version. Clearer. Sharper. Something that will stand. You title it simply, On the Origin of Species. It's not a war cry. It's a whisper with teeth. You write in bursts. You write in pain. You write with the ghosts of Annie and Charles Waring in your chest. You write with Wallace's breath still echoing in your ear. You write for the world. You write for yourself. And always, Emma is there. She watches you slip into longer silences. She brings tea to a desk cluttered with diagrams and pigeon bones. She says nothing, but her eyes ask everything. One evening, as you're revising a particularly thorny passage about human implication, she pauses beside you. You haven't written much about the soul, she says quietly. You don't look up. You simply reply, I don't know how to measure it. She nods and leaves you to the page. The weeks blur. You write through headaches, through nausea, through the hush of autumn falling outside your window. You trim and polish and question every line. This is not merely a book. It is your life distilled into sentences. When it is done, you send it to the publisher with shaking hands. And then for the first time in years, you walk outside, look up at the sky, and exhale. You have spoken. The world will answer. The first copies of On the Origin of Species arrive bound in green cloth gold lettering pressed into the spine like a quiet dare. You hold the book in both hands and feel its weight not just in ounces, but in consequence. This is no longer a drawer-kept manuscript, no longer private hesitation and backroom conversation. It is a declaration. And now it is out in the world. You open to the first page and read your own words aloud. There is grandeur in this view of life. Your voice falters, not from doubt no that's been with you for years, but from the ache of finally being heard. The print run sells out on the first day. You had expected resistance, fire, collapse. Instead, curiosity. Yes, there are critics, clergymen squinting at the text like it's written in sulfur, academics whose fingers twitch for red ink, theologians who accuse you of stripping the soul from man. One reviewer with theatrical flair claims your theory would reduce human nobility to a monkey's heritage. You smile at that one. But amid the outrage, a new kind of reader appears quiet, thoughtful, unsettled. They write to you, ask questions, seek understanding. Some say thank you. Some say, how dare you? Most simply say, I need to think about this. That is enough. You do not lecture. You do not debate in public. That's Huxley's role now. Your bulldog, they call him sharp-tongued, fearless, unshakable. He stands on stages tearing down opponents like ivy from a wall. You watch from afar, sometimes amused, sometimes alarmed. You've never enjoyed confrontation. You prefer the microscope to the podium, the garden to the hall. But your book is confrontational, whether you meant it to be or not. You spend the weeks after publication in a strange, suspended calm. No dramatic upheaval, just letters, inquiries, review clippings in the mail. Emma reads them with you. Some make her frown. Some make her close the page and set her hand quietly on yours. You've stirred something she says one evening by the fire. Trouble, you ask. Possibility, she replies. Your children grow. George takes to astronomy, Francis to plants. They ask you endless questions about gravity, about bees, about why the dog's fur turns lighter in winter. You smile and tell them everything is always becoming something else. At dinner one evening, Leonard asks if humans came from monkeys. You pause, with your fork in the air. Emma freezes. All the children look at you. You take a slow breath. We come from something older, you say gently. From many things that changed over many years. They accept it without fuss, as children do. You watch them return to their pudding and feel the ground shift under your feet, not violently, but certainly. It has begun. Still the world moves slowly. Bishops thunder from pulpits. Scientists argue in letters. One by one, the old guard either adapts or digs in. Your health worsens again. You retreat to the country more often. The fresh air soothes your lungs. The rhythm of insects calms your nerves. But even out here, the revolution hums around you. Papers publish new fossils. Botanists reclassify their herbaria. Young thinkers emerge eager, bold, unafraid. You receive a letter from Wallace, still in the East, congratulating you. Gracious as ever. You reply with warmth. You know the world will always see you as the father of this theory, but you've never forgotten that the child had 2 midwives. You continue your work. On orchids. On worms. On expressions in animals and men. Each book builds out from the last like branches from your tree. You try to avoid direct commentary on faith, but you can't stop others from drawing their own lines. Some declare evolution proof of God's plan. Some call it a dagger in faith's chest. You sit with both arguments. You sip your tea. You write another chapter. Emma watches all this with quiet grace. She does not question you as often now, but you catch her sometimes gazing into the fire as if listening for a voice that isn't yours. One evening, you ask her, "Do you think I've done harm?" She thinks a long while, then answers, "I think you've done what you had to do. And I think truth is never harm, not if spoken with care." You take her hand and say nothing more. As winter creeps over the garden, you look back, not with regret, but with wonder. You never wanted to ignite a revolution. You only wanted to understand. But understanding has its consequences. And sometimes the most dangerous ideas are born not from anger, but from quiet observation. You watch a finch in the hedge, its beak narrow and sharp. You think of the Galapagos, of mockingbirds, of 20 years of fear and silence. Then you smile, because now the silence is broken, and the world is listening. The fire doesn't arrive all at once. It spreads slowly, flickering through drawing rooms, lecture halls, and Sunday sermons, like a wind-fed spark catching on dry old wood. At first it's just talk, gentle inquiries, raised eyebrows, a new word. Darwinism begins to float through newspapers and drawing rooms, strange on the tongue, half respectful, half accusation. Then comes the debate at Oxford. You're not there, of course. You're at down wrapped in blankets, stomach aching, pretending to prune your orchids while secretly awaiting the verdict. Emma watches you with a look that says she knows better. She hands you a warm cup of broth and kisses your temple. Just letters you mutter, pretending to be indifferent. But you both know this isn't just a lecture. This is trial by fire. At the Oxford University Museum, the room is packed. A Bishop Samuel Wilberforce, elegant, confident, gleaming in his clerical robes, takes the stage. He mocks your ideas with rhetorical flair, dripping with sarcasm. He turns to Huxley and famously asks whether it was through his grandfather or grandmother that he claims descent from an ape. The audience laughs. But Huxley does not. He replies with that dry surgical tone only he can wield. I would rather be descended from an ape than a man who uses his gifts to obscure the truth. The room hushes, then roars, and just like that, your theory becomes more than ink on paper. It becomes battle cry. You read the reports the next day. The newspapers dramatize it. The public is split. Some call you the destroyer of God. Others hail you as the revealer of nature's truth. You sit quietly in your study, the fire crackling low, the air tinged with pipe smoke. Emma reads the papers, with careful calm underlining passages in pencil. You wonder what it's like for her to see your name caught between admiration and ridicule. You say, I never wanted war. She nods. But sometimes truth walks into one. In the months that follow, the fire spreads. Some universities forbid the book. Some professors resign in protest. A cartoon in Punch magazine depicts you as a monkey in a frock coat. You pin it to the wall and chuckle. They've drawn worse. You receive hate mail, some thoughtful, some venomous, some written in handwriting so large and shaky, you wonder if the rage broke the writer's pen. A few even threaten damnation. You respond to none of them. Instead, you plant trees. You dig in the soil hands, dirty heart quiet. You study earthworms. You watch how they drag leaves underground, how they shape the soil itself. You call them nature's gardeners. The irony doesn't escape you. While men argue about the soul, the worms continue unbothered, improving the world one tunnel at a time. Some firestorms cannot be fought. So, you return to the quiet. You walk daily along the sandwalk, your thinking path, your circuit of calm. The trees nod their branches. The sparrows sing indifferently. You observe. You take notes. You stay away from the noise. But the theory travels without you. It's being taught in classrooms, translated into German, French, Russian. It's leaping oceans. Young men are citing you. Older ones are denouncing you. Theologians hold sermons titled Against Darwin's Madness. Others whisper about reconciling evolution with the divine. You remain silent. You let the idea speak for itself. And still in private, the letters pour in. Some challenge, some praise. One woman writes, "Your book made me feel smaller, yet more connected to everything." Another confesses, "I wept while reading the final page. I never imagined science could feel like poetry." You carry those letters in your coat pocket, because in the middle of the storm, they remind you why you began. And yet, there are costs. Old friends distance themselves. Church invitations cease. Some family members ask Emma if you've gone too far. Even Wallace begins to shift, proposing that perhaps natural selection doesn't apply to the human mind, that maybe something divine still lingers there. You read his essays with furrowed brow. You feel a slow sadness rise, not betrayal, but distance. Even among those who see the truth, not all can look at it fully. But you don't fight them. You're not a crusader. You're a gardener, a chronicler, a reluctant revolutionary. And your revolution now no longer needs your voice to echo. It echoes without you. In the minds of students, in the pens of writers, in the lectures of biologists who build upon your work branch by branch, the firestorm becomes embers. The embers become warmth, and the warmth spreads. One day, as you watch a moth land on a flower, its wings dusted with gold, you whisper, "It took 20 years to let it out, and now it flies." The older you grow, the more you study quiet things. You observe worms moving earth with no audience. You note the bend of ivy toward sunlight. You spend an entire morning watching bees mistake purple petals for nectar landing, tasting, leaving again. It's not that you've turned from the great questions, only that you've come to understand greatness lies in the small. But not all small things are gentle. In your home, the silence between you and Emma grows more delicate. Not colder, never that, but more careful. The theory is out now. Breathing in, libraries, debated in churches, slipped into school books, with or without your name. And still her eyes watch you, not with judgment, but with a sadness that never speaks its name. One afternoon, you sit beside her as she embroiders. Her needle pierces cloth with a rhythm as steady as breath. You read her a letter, one from a bishop who surprisingly finds grace in your book. You think she'll smile. She doesn't. Instead, she says softly, "You've taken away the beginning." You pause. "I've tried to illuminate it." She places her needle down, but without intention. Charles, what is there to hold on to? You have no easy answer. You never have. So you speak as you always do, with metaphors. You hold on to the unfolding, you say, to the fact that we are part of something, not above it. She nods. It is not comfort, but it is your truth. And she has always made room for that, even when it trembles against her own. Still, the cost lingers. On Sundays, she walks to church alone. You watch her from the study window, her bonnet tilted just so her Bible clutched gently against her ribs. The children used to go, but now they split, some with her, some staying home, to study fossils with you. You never forbid faith, but you no longer share it. Yet every night she kisses your forehead. She smooths your hair. She sets out your medicine and says nothing of what's missing between the verses. Love, you've learned, does not require agreement, but it aches in its absence. You try in small ways to give her back something sacred. You build her a bench in the garden. You plant her favorite wildflowers along the sandwalk. You let her win at backgammon sometimes. And when your next book publishes The Descent of Man, you soften the language where you can. You do not lie, but you choose your words carefully, like one placing glass marbles on a nursery floor. In The Descent of Man, you finally say what everyone has been waiting for or dreading, that humans too are not exempt. That we, with our poetry and pride, are not the pinnacle, but a part, one branch on a vast tangled tree of life. You publish it, slowly wincing at every page. You know what it will do. You know who it will hurt. You know Emma will read it with trembling fingers. And she does. She finishes it in the drawing room one pale spring afternoon. The curtains flutter like anxious breath. When she closes the final page, she doesn't speak. She just looks at you. You meet her gaze, and in it is the question she has never asked, not once in 20 years. Why did you have to say it? And you answer not with a defense, not with a footnote, not with scientific language, just the only thing you can say. Because it is what I see when I look honestly. She blinks, and her hand rests on the closed cover. Her wedding ring catches the sun. Then she says, "I still believe, even if you no longer can." You reach across the small table and place your hand over hers. "I believe in you," you say, and somehow that is enough. The years pass with quietness. Fame drapes itself around you like ivy climbing without your help. You receive medals, awards, honorary degrees, invitations to lecture, to dine, to be celebrated. You decline most of them. You prefer the soil to the stage. You publish your book on worms. People mock it at first. Darwin, now a worm collector. but they read it anyway. And slowly, they realize this too is evolution. Not just the grand drama of apes and angels, but the slow, humble choreography of earth and leaf night and dew. Emma laughs when the book becomes a surprise success. Of course, it would be the worms, she says, stroking your hair. They've always known what matters, you reply. By now, the public no longer roars. The critics are quieter, their pens dulled by time and repetition. Evolution is no longer heresy, it is history. The world you feared has arrived, and it is less angry than you imagined. One afternoon, you receive a letter from a young girl, no more than 12. She writes, "I used to think people were separate from animals, but now I see we're all family. Even the worms." You laugh aloud. Emma looks up from her book and asks, "Good news?" You nod. "The best." And in that moment, for once, the silence between you holds not sorrow, but peace. You've never reclaimed your faith, but you've built a life full of reverence, just of a different kind. Reverence for pattern, for struggle, for mystery, for the deep, strange poetry of a planet that shapes itself. At night, as your breath slows and your bones ache more than usual, you watch Emma as she writes a letter by candlelight. She's still watching you, not to catch you, not to change you, but simply to be near. You once feared your truth would drive her away, but she stayed. She is still here, and so are you. Not alone, not quite divided. Just two minds walking side by side beneath different constellations in the same sky. You spend your final years not in great halls or lecture theaters, but among feathers and petals, bones and seeds. The world now knows your name. Scholars debate your ideas with rigor. Students read origin like scripture. But you still rise each morning and measure pea pods, observe pigeons, study worms with a boyish awe that has never left you. You are not building a monument. You are tending a garden. In that garden, your children wander. George always questioning. Francis with dirt under his nails and flowers in his pockets. Horace curious and quiet. They sit beside you in the study, ask about beaks, and breeding mimic your drawings. One day, Francis sketches a seedling with astonishing detail. You say nothing, only ruffle his hair and hand him a sharper pencil. You do not lecture them. You listen. They are your greatest experiment, not in control, but in care. You have come to see that the most lasting legacies are passed not by blood, but by curiosity. One day, Francis asks, "Do you think people will still talk about your theory when you're gone?" You smile. "I think the theory will talk for itself." And it does. Letters still arrive in bundles, some addressed only to Mr. Darwin, England. Clergy write, with questions, not curses. Teachers ask permission to reprint your tree diagrams. Farmers send notes about sheep born with odd markings and ask if it's natural selection, sir. You write back to as many as you can. You always have time for questions, and for pigeons, you still keep them. White ones, russet-crested. They coo from their coop like old friends. You sit among them for hours, recording notes, brushing molted feathers from your lap. Emma pretends to be annoyed with the feathers in your study, but she brushes them off your shoulder with an affection that's aged like good wine, mature, unshaken, quietly warm. You write another book, this time about emotional expression in humans and animals. It's less controversial, perhaps, but no less revolutionary. You argue that emotions evolved too, that the twitch of a dog's ear, the furrow in a man's brow, the laughter of a child are all leaves from the same tree. Not everyone agrees, but many understand. You include your own children in the research. You study their laughter, their tantrums, their sudden startles and dreams. Some critics call it unscientific. Others call it genius. You call it real. Your work continues not with fanfare, but with persistence. You take pride not in fame, but in fruit the slow, ripening kind. A single phrase in a colleague's paper. A new textbook for school children. A gardener who now sees weeds not as curses, but as competitors. You no longer need to prove anything. The theory has found its own legs, and yet you never stop adding to it. Even the worms, your final fascination, receive the same care. You spend weeks testing how they prefer leaves aligned. Do they drag them stem first into their tunnels? What patterns do they follow? What sense guides them? Friends tease you, from apes to earthworms. Charles, that's the arc of it. You reply with a grin. Everything decomposes eventually. Why not my attention? But it's not a joke. Not entirely. Because in the worm, you see the full circle. You see that the same processes shaping the beaks of finches shape the humus beneath your roses. You see that survival is not always grandeur. Sometimes it is patience, stillness, the unseen labor of tiny lives. Your health falters again. You tire easily. You stop traveling. But the world continues to come to you. Friends visit and sit on your garden bench. Younger scientists write to say your theory gave them courage to challenge old ideas. A child sends you a drawing of Mr. Darwin's evolution tree, complete with birds and elephants and a boy on the top branch waving. You keep it on your desk. Even Wallace writes often, still gracious, still curious. You share ideas like old shipmates sailing the same conceptual sea. One day, a letter comes from an obscure university. The writer says your book saved him, that he no longer feared questioning the world, that he finally felt like a part of nature, not apart from it. You fold the letter and tuck it into your notebook. You whisper, "That's enough. Not fame, not praise, but connection." The legacy you leave behind is not in stone. It is in motion, in the beak of a sparrow, in the curl of a baby's smile, in the seed that sprouts where none was expected. You walk the garden path slower now. Francis offers his arm. You wave him off, stubborn. You stop to admire a beetle, the same kind you chased as a boy. You pick it up, gently admire its glint, and set it back down. You whisper, "Still here." And it is. And so for now, are you? The garden has grown wild in places. Vines curl over the fence post. Bees hum softly in the lavender. In the stone, steps gather moss like memory. You walk slower now, cane in hand, each step placed with quiet care. Your hair is white, your face lined like riverbeds, drying after rain. But your eyes still search, always observing, always asking. The world outside Downhouse is louder than ever. Railways roar across the countryside. Telegraphs flash messages faster than birds. People speak your name in parlors and parliament halls. A man in a pub once told a friend he'd come from the same village as Darwin the ape man. You heard the story secondhand. You laughed until you coughed. The title never sat easily on your shoulders, founder of a theory breaker of myths. You never asked to be a symbol. You only asked questions. And in return, the world handed you both reverence and ridicule. But here among your notebooks and pinned beetles and well-worn slippers, you are not a theory. You are a man, and men like fossils grow still. You spend long hours in your study, sorting through old letters, some from years ago, faded to sepia, some still crisp, written in the careful loops of young hands. You find one from Annie, your daughter, folded neatly between 2 pages of a draft. It reads, Papa do Worms, Dream. You sit back in your chair and close your eyes. Sometimes, when no one is watching, you cry, but mostly, you smile. You begin sorting through your fossils, crates and cases cataloged and forgotten, bones of extinct beasts, petrified teeth, fragments of trilobites from a time when England was sea. You handle them gently with reverence. You once held these as proof, now you hold them like old friends. You turn one in your palm, a fossilized ammonite spiral, perfect and unbroken. You whisper, "You changed everything, didn't you?" But the stone says nothing. It never does. And yet, it speaks. You still write, though slower. A trembling hand, a fainter ink. Your last publications trickle out. Revisions, clarifications, careful extensions of what began with that first trembling tree. The children are grown now. Francis visits often, still working with plants. He reads your manuscripts aloud when your eyes ache. You sit by the fire, listening to your own words, astonished you once wrote them. You smile and tell him I sound more confident on the page than I ever felt. He replies, "That's how all truth begins soft-spoken." You watch as he closes the book and sets it on your desk. He doesn't know it yet, but he will carry your work forward. He will protect it, challenge it, expand it. You don't tell him this. You just say, "Check the footnotes. I think I forgot something in the worm section." The seasons pass in softer rhythms. You sleep more, dream more, of sea voyages and birds with curious beaks and endless walks beneath starlit skies. Sometimes in dreams, you are young again, chasing beetles through hedgerows pocket full of leaves, lungs full of sky. Sometimes you are older than you are now, walking through a museum where children gaze at skeletons of beasts you helped name, whispering your name as if it were part of the fossil itself. You wake from these dreams with a strange calm. You do not fear death. You've watched it work in leaf and larva, in lizard and worm. You've learned it is not an end, but a transformation, a return, a yielding. One gray morning, you sit in your chair by the window and gaze at the garden. Rain dots the glass. Emma is near, reading quietly, her fingers moving across the page like wind through grass. She looks up and smiles. You say, "I think I've been a very lucky man." She sets the book down. "You've been an honest one." You nod. And that, you think, is the greater gift. Later that week, a visitor comes, a young scholar from the university, shaking with admiration. He speaks of your work, with reverence stumbles over his own questions. He wants to know what it was like to change the way the world understands life. You consider for a moment, then say, "It was like watching something bloom. Slowly, then suddenly, everywhere." The young man writes it down. You smile and add, "But no flower blooms for itself." You send him away with tea and a bundle of notes he'll study for years. And that night, when the candles are low and the house is still, you sit at your desk one last time. You open your notebook. You draw a tree. Just one. Roots and visible trunk. Strong branches tangled and reaching. At the top, a single word underlined with care. Life. You close the book. It is April. A hush settles over Downhouse, like the pause between two heartbeats. The curtains ripple gently. The roses are not yet in bloom, but the buds are fat with promise. The garden waits, as if listening. You do not wake this time. Emma sits by your bed, holding your hand long after the breath has left your body. She does not weep at first, only watches. Watch as the stillness that has finally claimed the restless thinking man who paced through decades of silence, of sketches of strain. She leans close and presses her forehead to yours, and softly, almost soundlessly, she whispers, "You can rest now, Charles. The world has heard you. They bury you in Westminster Abbey, not far from Newton. The bells toll solemn and proud. You had asked to be laid to rest in the village church, near down, among the soil and worms beneath the trees you knew by name. But the world had other plans. They call you a national treasure, a scientific prophet, a genius who unstitched creation, then rethreaded it with natural law. But you were always just a man with a notebook asking questions too large to ignore. And now the world continues. Your books are translated into every language. School children draw evolutionary trees on chalkboards. Botanists, geneticists, paleontologists, they all build on your roots. The theory once trembling and hidden stands firm, now tested and refined, still evolving. And not only in science. A woman reads Origin to her daughter by candlelight in a cabin deep in Canada's north. A prisoner in Brazil copies your final chapter by hand. A young monk in Kyoto uses your model to rethink how species adapt through prayer, not against it. The idea has grown limbs of its own. It spreads in whispers, in textbooks, in the marvel of every small child who asks why the world is the way it is and receives no final answer, only deeper wonder. Your legacy is not carved in stone, but in behavior, in questions, in the way a teacher pauses before saying designed and instead says adapted, in the way someone walking through a forest feels not superior, but related. There is a man on a boat tracing islands on a map, and he is not you, but he carries your torch. There is a girl observing birds through a cracked lens in Uganda. She sees what you saw, but also more. A further branch, a longer view. And far beneath it all, in dark soil, worms continue. They do not know you, but they work as you did slowly, invisibly reshaping the earth. A century passes, then another. Still, the world moves. Not in leaps, but in shifts. In quiet, generational echoes. Just as you said, your name remains. But more importantly, so does your way of seeing. The stars have not dimmed. The trees still branch. And every time someone marvels at the diversity of life, at the improbable rise of consciousness, at the idea that everything came from something, and something came from everything, your voice returns. Softly, without force, only wonder. And now, as you sleep, beneath stone, beneath England's sky, beneath centuries of thought and soil and story, your theory breathes on without you. It does not need your defense. It does not seek your name. It only grows. And in that, you are finally free. So drift, Charles. Drift where there are no critics, no delays, no illness, only tides, only stars, only the slow, beautiful unfolding of everything again and again and again. Good night, old friend, and thank you.